Hello everybody. Want to thank you for joining us here today. My name is Derek Flayton. I'm a sales manager here at 3Keylogic. And this is what is going to be the first of a series of webinars that 3Keylogic will be hosting. Our intention with these is to address issues in the IT world that are top of mind and potentially confusing to people. Today our topic is one that honestly it always kind of seems to be in the news. And that's security. Specifically today, we're going to talk about security assessments. So what are they? What do they mean to you? And how can you leverage them to your advantage? So why don't we go ahead and get started? So today on our agenda, we'll do a brief introduction, talk a little bit about our presenters, talk about what is cybersecurity. We're going to define security assessments. We're going to talk about what assessment is potentially right for you, and then again, driving the strategic value of those. And at the end of this, we'll have an open Q&A, so feel free to hit us with whatever questions you come up with. So first things first, 3Keylogic. 3Keylogic is an IT services company. We're based here in Burnsville, Minnesota. We work with companies that have complicated needs, infrastructure challenges, growth, companies going through mergers. We specifically specialize in voice communication, networking, contact centers, and then obviously on today's topic, we specialize in security. Our presenters today are Ed. Ed is our Director of Product Development. He's 10 years of network engineer and an architect, and also oversight of software development practice here for 3Keylogic. Brian is our lead security engineer. He has multiple industry security certifications, and he's implemented security controls in Fortune 20 companies. So you guys are in good hands today. So I'm going to go ahead and let them move forward, and we'll get going.
All right. Hi there, this is Brian. I'll be starting us off just by talking about what is cybersecurity. And we're going to start off with this just so that we all have the exact same definition of cybersecurity. So when we move forward into the other areas of this presentation, we'll know exactly what I mean. So to start off with, what is cybersecurity? Well, what is security in general? And security in general means being free from threats or harm. So cybersecurity, we could then say, is being free from cyber threats and cyber harm. And it's the ability to work in a way that is secure in an interconnected world. A good definition that I found from James Mickens, who's a professor over at Harvard, is to ensure that systems do the right thing, even in the presence of malicious inputs. So even if we put a server out there on the internet and it's being hit by attackers and being hit by malicious users, it will still do the right thing, and that is proper cybersecurity. And cybersecurity over the years has really evolved. Back in the old days, computers were essentially just used by governments, universities, and very large corporations. They were the big giant mainframe computers, and everybody that used one had a trust relationship with that, either the system administrator, or if they wanted to connect to another computer, they already had a trust relationship with that other computer. So security in the way old days wasn't something that was very top of mind. But as we started having personal computers and started interconnecting everyone's personal computer, those trust relationships kind of dissolved, and you can no longer trust that every single computer connected out there is a good computer. And so that's kind of what we're trying to do. We're trying to make sure that we can still do what we need for work, but still be secure in what we do. So now that we know what cybersecurity is, if you're at an organization, oftentimes they're going to say, all right, well, we need to somehow manage our cybersecurity. So how are we going to do that? Oftentimes you'll start by implementing different security policies. This could be an acceptable use policy, password policies, incident response policy, and disaster recovery, just to name a few. There could be an entire laundry list of policies that you have in place to help manage your cybersecurity. So then after those policies, you're going to probably put in some sort of technological controls to make sure that the policies are followed and they're actually enforced properly. Then to make sure that employees know about the policies and know how to be secure, you usually move on to training those employees, and not just training them on, oh, hey, here's what a phishing email looks like, but training them on the policies and really explaining to them the reasoning behind the policies. oftentimes employees will subvert or go around policies or controls because, well, oftentimes it's easier for their job. If you can actually show them, oh, hey, here's the reason we have this, and give them a demonstration. So if they're upset that their password has to be 12 characters, and you do a demonstration of how easy it is to crack a password that is 8 or less characters, the employees are more likely to follow along with the policy and the controls you have. Our last one that we have on there is security assessments. And so then the security assessments will look at all areas of the organization and say, all right, here's kind of how your security is. Here's a score that we give it. And if you're following along, you may realize that I missed security compliance. And it is a good way to manage cybersecurity, but it complements frameworks and other things that were decided for your organization, generally by a governing body. And so you definitely want to follow security compliance, but you don't want that to be your end-all be-all of security. You're going to need to complement it with assessments to make sure you're doing other things correctly, along with controls and policy. So now that we've talked about what cybersecurity is and how to manage it, what about these security assessments, which will be the focus of the rest of our presentation? So just so that we're all on the same page with what a security assessment is, I have a definition here that's from this book, which is a security assessment, case studies for implementing the NSA-IAM. And even if you're not implementing the NSA-IAM, this is still a good definition that you can use across the board for general security assessments. And that definition is, information security assessment is a measurement of a security posture of a system or organization. And so a follow-up question that you might have to that is, well, what exactly is security posture? And your security posture is a point-in-time picture of how security is implemented across an organization at a certain point in time. So if we take that and look at it, a security assessment is a snapshot of an exact moment of how you are doing security and how that measures up to what you should be doing. So now we're going to talk about the different types of security assessments. Generally, if you're starting off, you're going to want to cover everything across the board, make sure all areas, all gaps can possibly be looked at. But as you mature, you may realize, oh, hey, I only need to do this part of assessment. I don't need to pay $500,000 to have this done every single year. I only need this part and this part. So we're going to define different types of security assessments, some that your organization might get a lot of value out of, some others you might not get as much value out of. And so we'll talk about those now. The first one that I have up here is business security assessments. And this one will generally be with a business analyst and a security auditor or assessor doing this hand in hand. And they'll be doing kind of a review of business process, business workflows. This will sometimes look at kind of workflows that can relate to fraud or can be abused. And I have two examples of this. And one is there's an example from, I believe it was 2016 with Starbucks, where they had a promotion where you could get a free coffee when it was your birthday on your Starbucks card. Well, what they didn't realize was that somebody out there wrote about, I believe, 10 lines of computer code to automate the system. So at the end of every day, it would update it so that their birthday was the next morning. And so every single morning, this user was going out and getting a brand new free coffee because they were able to look at, oh, hey, it's just at this time of day, if I change my birthday to the following day, it doesn't detect it and I can get a free coffee. Additionally, two other researchers also wrote an automated system that essentially printed out 365 Starbucks cards. And so they would just grab a new card every day and get a free coffee. And then one that's more recent in the news was in 2017, I'm sure you've heard about this, Amazon Web Services had a big outage in their Virginia data center. And that was because there was an engineer out there who was following their standard operating procedures, and he went to go make a single deletion. I believe it was to delete 100 items. Instead, he typed in 1,000 and ended up taking out a critical area of the business. And so a business security assessment would actually look in and say, oh, hey, there's the ability to make an enormous error in here. Maybe we should put a business process in here that before you click enter, it wants you to double check and confirm or have a manager confirm. All right, so now that I've gone through business security assessment, let's take a look at the next one, which is information security assessment. And with this one, it sounds like the end-all be-all of all of them, but with this, what we're actually focusing on is the data, the information itself. And so with this one, we're going to take a look at the data. Is it encrypted at rest? How is it encrypted at rest? Also, make sure that it is only encrypted. If you have a copy of it if you have a copy of passwords that are hashed, well, those encrypted ones don't do you much good. Making sure that it's properly stored, that it follows all guidelines that are set out for your organization, that company secrets are also properly taken care of, certificates are handled properly, customer data is secured and not accessible to those who don't need it, and making sure that essentially the information that your organization deals with is handled in a secure manner. Our next one is network security assessment. Over the past couple years, I've heard different definitions of it from different organizations, kind of depending on how they want to essentially build the scope of their assessment. But the general one that I've heard most often is network security assessments take a look at the network devices that your organization uses, that it directly uses to conduct its business. So this is taking a look at routers, switches, proxies, firewalls, additionally, any cloud networking equipment that can also transport data that your business will also use that you directly control. Taking a look at the configuration of it, also taking a look at the security model to make sure that there is no trust relationships that can be taken advantage of there or abused. And then another one is threat modeling. This is gaining more and more push out there nowadays. And this is kind of taking a look at the actual threats that you can be facing, but actually modeling it to how your organization is set up. So modeling it to how possible applications you have are set up. And so it would model out the workflow of an application from one area to another and saying, oh, hey, threats could come in from this area and this area. Additionally, you can do threat modeling on different areas of your company to make sure that you are actually taking into account all the threats that you could face. Now I'll hand it over to Ed to talk about some of the others.
All right, thanks, Brian. So as we get into our fifth one here, application security assessment. So an application security assessment is going to vary a little bit depending on if you develop in-house code. So if you have a software development practice in-house in your organization, then an application security assessment is oftentimes going to end up focusing on the review of that code for secure coding practices. And in today's world, that typically will also include a review of the dependencies and maybe even some of the licensing that those dependencies, that your code depends upon, to ensure that not only are your developers and any contractors you might be using following secure coding practices, but also that any kind of maybe open source projects or frameworks that you might be using in your code are also secure and up to date. If you don't do any kind of custom development, then application security assessments are typically going to be focused on, are your applications up to date, and are they deployed in a secure manner? Do they have proper access control? Are they on servers that are configured properly? Things like that. And now those things are still important even if you deploy your own software, but again, these things might vary a little depending on your organization. So I think that leads us right into a vulnerability assessment. A vulnerability assessment is typically an automated scan for vulnerabilities in your organization. Now these vary in scope quite a bit because you can deploy a vulnerability assessment in different ways. You might, for example, do a scan internally on maybe internally facing applications or application servers. You also might do one externally, looking at any internet-facing services you might have or any cloud-hosted services you might have. We oftentimes run into customers or run into situations where people will say, oh, well, we do a security assessment monthly, or we do one very often. And we find in many cases that the security assessment that they're referring to is actually a vulnerability assessment. And so vulnerability assessments are a key part of assessing your security, but it's important to keep in mind that they are scanning for known vulnerabilities typically, and they're going to be very limited in their scope of what they can actually assess. So these other assessments, of course, are important to fill out your complete security picture. And then a risk assessment. A risk assessment is typically going to be a little less focused on sort of individual software vulnerabilities and more focused on business and financial impact of risk in your organization. So a risk assessment, especially inside of security, is going to be focused on probability and impact of these risks. So usually this comes down to looking at where are the lines of income or lines of business that are most important, what assets are most important inside the business, and then grading the impact of different types of potential security risks. And then, of course, grading the impact of those, typically tying all of that back to a monetary impact. So, and then our last one on the list here, at least the last one on the list that we're going to talk in depth about here, is the threat assessment. So as we've talked about these first seven, the first seven of these are pretty strategic. You could do them often, but they're not something that's going to get done in a matter of an hour or two, right? They're going to take some time. And typically the results coming out of them are going to take some time for you to parse and then use them to implement some improvement in your organization and then do the assessment again at another time to kind of show that you've improved. The threat assessment is a little bit different. So the threat assessment is about, much more of a tactical assessment to determine the credibility and potential impact of a sort of a clear and present threat. So that might be something like a natural disaster or a bomb threat, or to kind of pull it back to cybersecurity, could be something like a threatened denial of service attack or ransomware within your organization. So that threat assessment is really about a quick or relatively quick assessment of one of these types of current threats, and then what kind of response and what you can do in the short term to mitigate that, or to what the proper response there might be.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ed. Yeah, and we have these 8 categories that we have up here, but you might be thinking to yourself, well, I've heard a lot about penetration tests and red team engagements. Why aren't those up there? And we're more focusing on, well, at least in this webinar, we'll potentially have another webinar in the future going into other categories. We wanted to focus on assessments that oftentimes you can do internally or externally, and where you would bring in some sort of a security assessor or security auditor. So yeah, penetration tests are good, red teaming engagements are good, but we're focusing on the assessment area. Additionally, you might ask yourself, well, what about contract or security around contracts or staffing or vendor relations? And again, we could do an entire another webinar just on vendor risk management and staffing risk and those topics. So we're trying to stay on just the security assessment topics at hand. So next, now that we've introduced these 8 types of security assessments, how do you know exactly which assessment is right for you? And as we've discussed the definitions of these different assessments, you may have noticed, oh, there seems to be a little bit of overlap between this one and this one. There seems to be a little overlap between, risk and kind of several of the other ones. And there will be, but that's okay, because there will still be gaps. And so if you've never done an assessment before, we recommend having a security assessment look at every single one of those areas. Look at the business, look at the information, the network, the threats, the applications, vulnerabilities, and risk. Make sure that you have a picture of everything that's going on within the organization at a single point in time when you're starting. Also, you're going to want to manage the breadth versus depth of the assessment. So say that you're doing regular vulnerability assessments, but you kind of lack depth into other areas, so you don't really have a lot of idea of the exact network security, exact security configuration of your routers, switches, and networking infrastructure. Maybe you just want an in-depth assessment of just the network security. Also, you want to take into account what areas of the business will have the highest impact. And so if you have applications that earn your business the majority of its income, you're going to want to have an application security assessment done more often than some of the other areas of security assessments. And yes, you can enlist a vendor who can help you determine your needs also. So if you're still unsure, you can go out there to a company that does risk assessments and risk or security audits, and they can help you figure that out. And if you would just like to try it out by yourself, on our website at 3keylogic.com, in our Knowledge Center, we have a security self-assessment, which is based off the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, and will report back to you your top threats, and it will tell you if you do or do not have some sort of controls in place to protect against them. So if you want to figure out where to even begin, if you don't really know, that's a good place to start.
All right. So now that we've talked about which assessment might be right for you, we should talk a little bit about what we might want to do to prepare for a security assessment. And again, this is really to sort of start to align ourselves so that we can get the most value out of one of these assessments. So as we get into this, some of these might seem a little bit evident, but we'll talk in depth about each one. So your first step is really to know yourself and your organization. And what I mean by that is that you really need to be able to focus in on where are the high value assets in your organization. And how is it that your organization or your business, depending on what your situation might be here, how do they do business on a day-to-day basis, right? Where are these lines of business that are actually bringing in revenue? And because no matter what we're doing here in security, we need to make sure that we're not really standing in the way of that. We're here to enable that business. So identifying what is most important, that's really going to come down to where are the crown jewels? What are the highest value assets in the organization? This is something that you wouldn't necessarily have to know to do an assessment, but if you don't know this, it's going to be very difficult to get the most value out of one of these assessments or even to choose the right one. So third, know your budget. We live in a world of finite resources, and so in many cases, your budget will be limited. You may not have the luxury of being able to bring in a ton of auditors and just do every single assessment. And so building on what we've already done here, looking at your organization and sort of identifying the highest value assets or highest value portions of the business, we need to then balance the security budget against those. And so when we start looking at doing a security assessment, we need to, number one, kind of at a base level, just make sure that the cost of doing this assessment does not outweigh the cost of replacing or repairing that asset that we're going to be looking at. And on top of that, the assessment is a good way to verify compliance, but it's also a good way to sort of set that baseline, set your first guidepost in how you may begin to set your security strategy. So as you're looking at these high value assets, your first assessment would be to kind of set your baseline for where you are in that space around that asset. And then leaving some budget, because we know there's going to be an investment of time, resources, and monies probably to enhance some of the security gaps that are found in that assessment. And then our last one here is defining a goal of the security assessment. I say define a goal here because just getting the assessment kind of goes without saying, right? And it's not necessarily the right goal for this situation. So a good example here might be that if you have an area where you have limited knowledge, the goal of your security assessment might be to get some actionable metrics and some to kind of set a picture of where you are. And the goal from that may continue in that you should be able to set maybe a couple of remediation goals from the assessment.
All right, so now that we know how to prepare, how do we figure out when do we need one of these security assessments? And so I have some options up here. A, do you need one never? B, do you need one continuously? Or C, both A and B? This is my attempt at humor. Of course, it's not going to be C, or is it going to be A? And it's generally not even B. So this is kind of just a trick question that I threw up there. And some people might say, well, hey, I do vulnerability assessments all the time. But you're not doing every aspect of every single security assessment continuously. It just wouldn't be cost effective. So the most important time when you do want to have a security assessment done is when there is major organizational change. And so that would be any type of environmental shift inside of the organization. So if you get new management, if you reorganize the company, or if there's new technology, new servers, new workstations, making sure that there's some sort of assessment done so that we can get actual metrics and numbers around that change and say, yes, we are actually more secure now after this change, or no, after this change we have slid slightly backwards. And also it's going to be determined by the company and not just compliance. And what I mean by that is I worked with some companies who had to be high-tech compliant, and so they did their own quarterly assessments. They would do additional assessments in between that if there was what they would call major organizational change, so that they could get correct metrics and have it easier to be in compliance. In addition to doing those internal ones, they were required to do external security assessments and security audits on everything. So they followed what was needed by the compliance, but they also did what they determined to be necessary for the company to actually make their compliance easier. Another thing that might determine when you need security assessment is dependent upon your software development lifecycle that you use. And so this will also kind of determine how much change is out there and when to deep dive into an assessment that can affect an area like that. If you're more agile and you're making lots of changes all the time, you may want to wait until a lot of those changes add up to be one major group of changes to do an assessment. Or if you're doing giant changes all at once, that would be another good time to look at it. But again, you don't want to do assessments every other day because that could burn up time and the budget. And lastly, one last point that I forgot to put out there is you want to make sure that you do another security assessment when your previous one is no longer relevant. We've gone out to companies who they would go through mergers, and the last time there was a real in-depth security assessment was completed was during the previous merger. And so you need to remember that you should probably continue to update these, and if your previous one is no longer relevant, please look into doing a new one.
All right. Okay, so we've talked about preparing for a security assessment, and we've also talked a little bit about when you might need one. So now we will talk a little bit about getting the best value for your security assessment. So as we look at this, one of the things we kind of need to accept during our preparation for a security assessment is that this is an ongoing process. Maybe that seems obvious to a lot of people, but typically this will be a process of evolution, not revolution. And so the security assessment fits well into setting an ongoing security strategy because it is a good way for you as a leader to get an outside perspective on your organization in certain areas, again, focused on certain high value assets typically, and then set an ongoing roadmap for how you're going to improve that security. So you can take that first security assessment, look at some of the places where you've scored low or not scored very well, perhaps not the level you want. And then when it comes time to planning improvements or application of resources, time and effort to those, your additional security assessments should then back up those investments that you've made. So again, we kind of just need to accept that this is an ongoing process. The flip side of that, this isn't something that we can look at, then ignore for a quarter, and then come back to, and having done nothing in between, and expect our security to maintain, because it will degrade over time as well. So, so fitting right in with that, we need to make sure that these assessments that we are preparing to do result in actionable metrics. So that's both our responsibility as well as the vendors or anyone who may actually perform this metric for you. We really need to kind of put them on the spot and look for actionable metrics that we can continue to track over time. So prioritization. We need to prioritize what needs to be done first. And what that really comes down to is, again, finite resources. We only have so much time and money to do these assessments. So we need to make sure that we're looking at the highest value assets in the organization, grading those, and continuously revisiting them over time. So each time we plan to do another assessment, perhaps the organization has changed which assets are most valuable, or perhaps products have changed or something along those lines. And so we need to make sure that we keep that in the back of our mind as our organization evolves. And then balance. Potentially, if your organization is of a sufficient size, or you perform certain assessments on a very frequent basis, it may make sense to pull some of those assessments internally. Now, of course, you'd have to train some staff and equip some staff to do these assessments. But in some organizations, that makes a lot of sense, again, if there's a certain type of assessment that you're doing on a very regular basis. But when we get back to balance here, we might be able to save ourselves a little bit of capital there. But on the other side, we need to make sure that we mix in external vendors occasionally so that we don't have the same set of eyes constantly reporting to us the same thing. It's kind of like editing your own writing. You have a tendency to sometimes overlook your own assumptions or mistakes. And so it's always good to mix in an external party to take a look at that. And on the flip side of that, if you do use all external parties, it's a good idea to change up those external parties occasionally. You might have a vendor that you prefer or a vendor that you work with often, have a good relationship with. Doesn't mean you have to move away from them, just means that you may want to mix in another party occasionally. Again, get that valuable external perspective so that you're not always making using the same lens, perhaps is the best way to say that. All right, so this takes us right into some questions that we might ask both ourselves and an assessor as we get into doing one of these assessments. So I know I kind of sound like a broken record when it comes to this, but one of the best things to ask ourselves, and this is both at the beginning of the assessment as well as when we're actually kind of reviewing scope and really getting into it here, is what metrics are we going to bring back to the organization from this assessment? So again, I kind of look at these assessments as using them to set nice guideposts as we move along over time, with the plan of always doing that assessment again at some point. And it's going to be very difficult for you to compare assessments and then show the value that all that time and effort that was invested based on the first assessment, how that has all kind of come to fruition in that second assessment, if there are no metrics. Just having a list of recommendations is nice and probably valid, but again, it's going to be difficult to track those things. So whatever the scoring methodology that's used here or that you decide to adopt inside that assessment is, you want to make sure that you continue that and that you kind of put all these vendors on the hook for that. Second, what will not be covered in the assessment? This is a good question to ask yourself as well as anyone who might be undertaking one of these assessments. When we say what's not covered as opposed to what is, when we talk, the good example I like to use for this, when we talk about like a network assessment, oftentimes a network assessment will cover the obvious things like routers, switches, firewalls, and proper configuration of those devices and of perhaps other network devices. But some network assessments, again, kind of depending on who provides them, may include all nodes attached to the network. And again, that's a very different scope and potentially a much more broad assessment. And maybe that's what you want, but the good question here is to ask what is not covered by that assessment. Probably a little bit easier question to ask in many cases versus what is covered. And then third, how does this assessment relate back to the highest value assets in the organization? Again, we always want to make sure that we are getting a maximum value here for the assessment, right? And that means for the time and effort we're going to invest in doing this assessment and participating in it. are we always tying that back to high value assets? So are those assets still the same assets that we thought they were last time? Are they still as important to the organization as we thought last time?
All right, thanks, Ed. Some additional questions that you should be asking are, will this assessment examine the security impact of any recent change that has occurred? This brings me back to the point that I made earlier that you want to have a security assessment done whenever there is major organizational change. And so this is a good question to ask to make sure that if there is reorganization or some sort of change, oftentimes if you're doing the same assessment, you might forget that, oh yeah, there's this, we need to actually be looking at this large area of change over here, so let's broaden the scope and make sure that we include that in this assessment. Another question is, how will this assessment account for organizational nuances? And this will differ between company and company. Each company does something unique or slightly different. So if you're dealing with a lot of legacy technologies, or if you're dealing with a lot of industrial control systems, each of those will have their own nuances and aspects to them that should be taken into account by the assessor or by the auditor when that's being done. Oftentimes they'll see some legacy technology and put in an extra 5 pages of recommendations and metrics and remediation paths that can be taken when you already have a path to sunset that technology. And so by going over that question, you can kind of get that out of the way ahead of time so they can spend more time diving into other areas where they can find out more information. Lastly, this may seem like a simple one, which is before the assessment starts, asking the assessor or the auditor, do you have all the necessary information for the assessment? And then reviewing all the information they have. This is kind of in lines where at hospitals and ERs, they had doctors asking simple questions such as, do we have the correct patient? Do we know what procedure we're performing? Are we all set to start this? And by starting out with these simple questions, they actually cut down the amount of accidents that were happening. Not that there would be accidents in a security assessment, but it allows it to go smoother and get more value out of it when you kind of run through everything with them to make sure that all the information is there ahead of time. All right, so now that we've gone over all the questions that you can ask in the assessment, are there any questions for us? We'll take a minute to let everybody type in a question if you want, and then we'll get to them. All right. And you can still type in your questions. Yep. Looks like there'll be a couple.
All right, so we have a good question here. Should you switch the audit firm each year or just the assessor performing the audit? That's a great question.
Generally, I would say switch the audit firm. A lot of times the assessors within that firm will be trained in the same way or the same area, so they might actually still have the same gaps or might not look at something the same way another company might.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions out there for us? Well, the guys covered quite a bit of information. No? Okay. Well, thank you everyone again for attending today. We really appreciate you taking your time out of your day to spend some time with us. And if you have any questions for us moving forward, we did actually get one more question. It's how do you recommend adopting new technologies?
It would depend on how large the technology is and how impacting it is to the company. So if it's a large impacting technology, a multi-stage approach where you break it up to only impact smaller areas at a time is what I would generally recommend. It depends how it impacts the company and what areas, but generally that's an approach that we take. Is the larger the impact, the more we kind of break it up into smaller and smaller stages of deployment. And so then once it's all fully deployed, hopefully everyone's fully trained on it, and then it's fully adopted.
Yep, I think, yeah, I think that's a good description, Brian. I would also recommend that depending on how you're adopting that technology and what sections of your business it's going into, like if this is, for example, a very externally facing or direct customer facing technology, again, something that carries, we'll say maybe more potential for a malicious actor to take a shot at, then I would definitely recommend potentially running through some kind of initial assessment or early security review of this technology in an early stage of its life cycle, perhaps during a pilot phase or during a limited deployment. I wouldn't wait until it's completely out there in full production to start down that path.
Any other questions? All right, well, not seeing anything else pop up, so I'm just going to go ahead and I think another one might be showing up here. One moment.
Yep, there you go.
All right, so this question is, where do pen tests fit in with an overall assessment plan? This is a great question, and this could even lead us into the webinar that we'll be doing at another point in time talking about that. And so oftentimes you're going to need to do a pen test when you are a fully security mature company, because if you don't even know where your security is at yet and you do a pen test, well, it won't give you the best value. You should start with generally a security assessment. Once you know where you're at and you've gotten your security scorecard up to where you believe that you're mature enough to have a pen test, that's where it would fit in. And your follow-up question might be, well, how do I know when I'm finally mature enough for a pen test? That's generally going to be decided by upper management, by a CIO level or a CISO. And they will kind of say, all right, at this point, we believe we've done the best we can. We have the monitoring in place. We have the tools in place. Now it's time for a pen test to see where our additional gaps still are. And that's what a pen test is. And a pen test isn't to prove that you're invulnerable and you're perfect. A pen test is to say, all right, we've done the best we possibly can so far. Where are our existing gaps anyway?
Yeah, and I think just to add to that a little bit, Brian, a penetration test needs to be done on a fairly hard target, I guess we should say, because typically a penetration tester is going to look for the first way in that they can find, and they're going to take it. And at that point, once they're in, that's typically the end of the penetration test. And so if you are not security mature in the organization, or if the maturity is fairly low yet, it's likely that they're going to find a way in somewhere. Again, whether that's, they social engineer their way in, or perhaps they just find a vulnerable system, and then it's over. And so sometimes that is not a real good picture of where you sit as a whole.
So the next question we have is, which of these assessments does 3Key Logic offer? Which is obviously a great question.
Yep, the ones that we offer, we cover that whole board there. We also have what we call the 3Key Logic in-depth, where we kind of sit down with you for multiple weeks at a time throughout a cycle and give you accurate metrics. So we can actually do that board of 8 security assessments that we've just talked about, plus an in-depth overview of everything that you have. So if you just want to dive into one area, you can. If you want to look at everything, you can. If you want to look at, oh, hey, we want to make sure our JavaScript of the week framework is secure, we can do that also.
That's really where we recommend you heading to our website, 3keylogic.com. Check out that free security assessment that's on there. It's a great place to start, just for, you know, if you have any questions or if you're just curious kind of where you stand. As you know, obviously, I think the one thing this webinar has really shown us is that there's not a cut and dry answer in these scenarios. So that's a great place for you to move forward. And then after that, we can address it with you after that and see what we can do to help you out. Any other questions? Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and I think give everybody the rest of their hour back. Thank you so much. We really, really appreciate everybody for being on here today and taking the time. Again, if you are interested or have further questions, feel free to reach out to us. 3keylogic.com. Go ahead and hit us up on there. There's multiple places and a lot of actually really good information. These guys do blog posts all the time and lots of cool stuff to read on there. We will actually also be posting this webinar as well. So if there's something in there that you want to take a peek at, definitely can go back and look. So thank you very much and have a great day.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.